Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 1093 for January 26th, 2025. Coming up in a few minutes.
My push is to get people to look at whiskey history as part of overall human history, because it has tied in so much into our lives. So finding those little discoveries and tying regular history in with whiskey history, and then learning things that I've been saying wrong for the longest time and being able to correct those, and then see the surprises on people's faces when you reveal to them that what we think we've known all along isn't really true.
Drew Hannush takes some of the lore and myths surrounding whiskey and finds the facts to back them up or bust the myths completely. His new book is Whiskey Lore, Volume 1, and he'll join us this week on WhiskyCast In-Depth to take a look at some of those myths, such as how bourbon got its name. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, behind the label, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
The second release in Dewar's four-part collector series, Dewar's Double Double 38-Year-Old, is now available. It's a tribute to the Scottish Highlands, and it's like nothing you've had before. More in a minute.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. U.S. President Donald Trump said this week that he wants 25% tariffs on all imports from Canada and Mexico starting February 1st. However, he stopped short of issuing an executive order imposing the tariffs. Trump is accusing both countries of not doing enough to stop the flow of illegal immigrants and drugs across the border. The tariffs would affect Canadian whiskey, which counts the U.S. as its largest export market. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau responded with a threat to impose dollar-for-dollar tariffs on bourbon and other U.S. exports, but Ontario Premier Doug Ford is ready to go one step further. He's ordered the Liquor Control Board of Ontario to pull all American-made products off its shelves if Trump goes through with his threat. The LCBO is one of the biggest buyers of liquor in the world, and a boycott of bourbon and other American-made whiskeys would have an impact on U.S. exports. It's not clear whether other provinces would follow Ontario's lead. Bourbon was on the menu at Trump's inauguration Monday. Brown-Forman supplied bottles of Woodford Reserve to the attendees at Trump's inaugural luncheon in the Capitol. Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell reportedly played a role in sourcing the whiskey. Kentucky's Log Still Distillery also created a special whiskey for the inaugural ball. America's 47 is a blend of two high-rye bourbons and a wheated bourbon. The 47 comes from Trump's place as the 47th president, and Log Still's distillery permit, which happens to be DSP KY 47. New Riff Distilling supplied its bourbon for the Bluegrass Ball celebrating the state of Kentucky. In other news, the Bad Spaniels case is back before us. An Arizona federal judge ruled Thursday that the dog toy designed to look like a bottle of Jack Daniels dilutes Brown-Forman's trademark rights. The ruling follows a 2003 Supreme Court ruling that the dog toy is not protected by the First Amendment. This case has been in the courts since 2014, proving that the wheels of justice grind slowly. In news out of Scotland, Eden Mill Distillery has installed the stills at its new distillery near St. Andrews. The distillery is expected to begin production in March and open its visitors center this summer. Rosebank Distillery manager Malcolm Rennie is moving to Islay. He'll be the manager for the new Lagan Bay Distillery being built on the island. Rennie oversaw restoration work on Rosebank for Ian MacLeod Distillers, which is building Lagan Bay, in a partnership with the Islay Boys whiskey bottlers and brewers. Highland Park is releasing its oldest whiskey ever, a 56-year-old single malt distilled in 1968. Whiskey maker Gordon Motion selected the cask for this whiskey back in 2008 and refilled it into a first-fill sherry-seasoned cask. Only 170 bottles will be available with a price tag of £40,000 each. Other new releases to mention, Woodford Reserve has released a new edition of Double Double Oaked, its extra-matured version that has been a distillery exclusive until now. The whiskey takes regular Woodford Reserve Double Oaked and ages it for an extra 2 years in a new charred oak cask. It's priced at $199.99 a bottle, and I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. Sister brand Old Forester is also out with the return of Extra Old, its 117 series bottling from 2022. This whiskey takes Old Forester 1910 bourbon and ages it for an additional 18 months. It's available at the distillery and select Kentucky retailers for $64.99 a bottle. Heaven Hill has released this year's first batch of Elisha Craig Barrel Proof. Batch A125 is 10 years and 7 months old and comes in at 59.1% ABV. It'll retail for around $75 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for it in a few minutes. Knob Creek has teamed up with Eli Manning to offer a special single barrel pick for the Super Bowl. It'll be available in New Orleans, New York, and Los Angeles for $59.99 a bottle, and there's a contest tie-in to win a trip to the James B. Beam Distilling Company in Kentucky. Westland Distillery has released its third edition of Solemn, its peated American single malt smoked with Washington State peat. It's part of Westland's Outpost series of American single malts and will be available in limited quantities for $149.99 a bottle. New Riff Distilling is re-releasing its Balboa Rye made with heirloom grain. It'll be available starting this Friday at select retailers in the U.S. and at the distillery, with a recommended retail price of $59.99 a bottle. Colorado's Laws Whiskey House is out with Super Wheater, a high-wheat whiskey that blends Laws' bourbon with its Centennial Wheat whiskey. It's part of the Laws Origin series and will be available at the distillery and select retailers for $129.99 a bottle. And finally, the Fife Arms Hotel in Aberdeenshire, Scotland has a 5-star whiskey list, as evidenced by a recent bar tab for a group staying at the hotel. They drank their way through 67,500 pounds worth of Balvenie 50-year-old Scotch, along with 40,000 pounds worth of Lafroig from the 1940s, and 12,750 pounds worth of Glenlivet 1943. According to the Daily Mail, the group racked up a tab totaling 158,914 pounds. That's with tax, but before the tip. I'd love to see the expense account for that bar tab. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Let's take a look at some of the whiskey events going on around the world in the coming weeks. Tickets are still available for the Whiskey Exchange's Ardnamurchan and Adelphi Masterclass this Thursday night at the Great Portland Street Shop in London. The Whiskey Global takes place this Saturday in Kelowna, British Columbia. The Atlanta Winter Bourbon Festival is on the 8th. The Maritime Spirits Festival is on the 13th in Moncton, New Brunswick. Tickets are still available for the Brandy Library's Great Bourbon's Spirit School class on the 15th in New York City. The Whiskey Wonderland Festival runs from February 20th through the 22nd in Ottawa, Ontario. And finally, Dramfest 2025 starts February 28th and runs through March 2nd in Christchurch, New Zealand. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it. We'll add it to the calendars at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app.
Dewar's Double Double 38-year-old is the second release in a 4-part limited edition collector series honoring Scotland's most legendary whiskey regions. This rare blended malt, a tribute to the Upper Scottish Highlands, is crafted from nearly 4-decade-old Highland and Islay whiskies. It undergoes Dewar's unique 4-stage aging process with a final finish in Pedro Jimenez sherry casks from the prestigious Royal Brackless single malt. The finish invites you to explore your own tasting notes, but for me, there's incredible depth, with rich layers of vanilla, toasted cereals, dried figs, plums, dark chocolate, and a subtle hint of Islay smoke, all beautifully balanced. To truly elevate this tasting experience, renowned chef Gabriel Cruther, in collaboration with Dewar's, has created an exclusive selection of custom chocolates. Crafted from the world's finest ingredients, each piece is infused with a few precious drops of Dewar's Double 38-year-old whiskey, making this a luxurious and unforgettable pairing. Now available, this exquisite pairing of whiskey and chocolate promises to deliver an unforgettable experience. Please drink responsibly. Copyright 2024. Dewar's is a trademark. Imported by John Dewar and Sons Company, Coral Gables, Florida. Blended Scotch whiskey, 48.8% alcohol by volume.
This week on WhiskyCast In-Depth, we're going to look at some of the legends surrounding whiskey. Historians often disagree on the facts behind these legends, and writer Drew Hannush has done his own research into some of whiskey's legends. His new book is Whiskey Lore Volume 1, and we spoke on a Zoom call this week. So what prompted you to bust a bunch of myths in this book?
Well, I had started actually long ago when I started doing my trips to different distilleries around the country and over to Scotland, absorbing all of those marketing myths that we hear from distillery to distillery. And I kept hearing contradictions in particular stories, which kind of raised my interest level. And as I started thinking about how I could approach researching those and what I could do with them, I decided to do the Whiskey Lore podcast, where I did my research online and, tried to find what the true answers were to some of these myths and mysteries. But over time, what I found was after I worked on my book, The Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey, I couldn't really rely on the internet for my answers. I would go through. Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's so funny because I'm doing a reworking of my Experiencing Kentucky Bourbon book right now, and I went back and read the bourbon history that I wrote in 2020, and I'm going, wow, yeah, you just threw every bit of marketing lore into that you possibly could, because I didn't know any better, but because that's what the source was. If you were going to go out, you were mostly finding some historians posting stuff out there, some stuff through books, and then a lot of stuff was coming from distilleries' websites. So if you're going to read Buffalo Trace's website, you're going to get Buffalo Trace's slant on, what's going to sell their whiskey, and not necessarily the deeper research that a historian would do. So I found that I needed to monetize this in some way because I've never really taken advertising for the Whiskey Lore podcast. And writing books gave me the ability to really dig in deep and do more research. And I didn't want to just do a book on Kentucky bourbon. I didn't want to just do a book on Scotch or Irish whiskey. I wanted to really dive into the myths and lore from all sorts of different types of spirits and their histories, because they all tie together in one way or another. And so I thought the best way to do that was, why don't I take some of the stories I did on the Whiskey Lore podcast, but also find some other myths and legends. And originally this was meant to be a book called 101 Whiskey Myths Debunked, but I found that I'm too much of a storyteller, and that this is something that's got to be done in a longer form than just a one-page answer to say why, this particular myth or lore is incorrect. So I'm going to turn it into a series, and this is actually book one out of maybe 4 or 5 books.
Let's go through some of these myths and get the facts on them as you've been able to find them. The Lincoln County process. We are told that this started with Nearest Green.
Right.
Officially
right.
From the Uncle Nearest folks. But you found some data that are details that go back beyond Nearest Green, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is the story that we've heard for a long time. When you go through on the Jack Daniels tour for a long time, it was Dan Call, or it came through, there's talk that it's a technique that actually came from further back, and that Nearest Green was somebody who employed it and maybe not necessarily invented it. But you will hear people from time to time say that they believe that maybe he or Alfred Eaton, who was a potential mentor of Jack Daniel, might have been the ones that came up with it. But it's one of those stories that actually you can go back and you can find that it's not necessarily a Tennessee technique. It was actually being used back in at least 1803 because President John Quincy Adams was in his diary upset over the fact that there was a New Jersey preacher who was trying to get a patent on using the charcoal filtering process, which was known as leaching back then, as something that he wanted to get a patent for. And John Quincy Adams said, "This is an abuse of the patent office. This is a technique that is, well used throughout whiskey making. It's a term called rectifying, which we kind of put towards a thought of what the modern slant on rectifying is it's that late 19th century when everybody was tossing all sorts of additives into whiskeys to make them taste like whiskey or look like whiskey. But back then, rectifying simply meant to improve a spirit in some way or another, and running it through charcoal was one of the tools in the toolbox for those early distillers.
So we know it goes back then to at least 1803.
Yeah.
But before then?
Probably was used before then as well, but it's really almost impossible to go back and find out. I mean, the concept of running something through charcoal, as it was explained to me, there's so much surface area in charcoal that you can actually clean the color out of a whiskey by running it through charcoal. So this is something that could be used for water filtration and many other needs. And so it's likely a ancient practice that has just found its way to whiskey. There
was
time.
a Canadian whiskey that did just that. They leached all the color out with the charcoal filtering.
Yeah.
I called it White Owl.
Very interesting. Yeah. And I didn't know that was a fun part of going through this research is you stumble into these little facts that it's not the question you would ever really ask. Oh, how can you get the color out of a whiskey? But there you go.
You also bust, or at least try to explain, the biggest myth of all, where bourbon got its name.
Yes.
What's your take?
Well, as I was digging through, I initially started this quest when I was doing the Whiskey Lore podcast, and I did 2 separate episodes. And one episode was proving the Bourbon Street theory that it came from Bourbon Street in New Orleans, and the other is that it came from Bourbon County. Well, when I did that episode, I had no idea at all, and I ended up going down to New Orleans and spoke with a woman who has a drinks podcast down there. She does a lot of history research also, Elizabeth Pierce, and she said that it had pretty much been proven by local historians that Bourbon Street really didn't have any kind of whiskey culture in the years that bourbon got its name. And so that was one thing that really I hung my hat on in doing that research. Since then, I have been doing a lot of research into Bourbon County whiskey, and what I discovered is that the first mention that always gets brought up was at Limestone Landing, which is modern-day Maysville on the Ohio River in Kentucky, was the source of these barrels that were flowing down the river that said Old Bourbon on them, and that there was a advertisement of a wholesaler who was selling bourbon whiskey. It's the first mention of bourbon whiskey in 1821 in the Bourbon County Western Citizen newspaper. And when I read that, I look at it and I go, you could interpret that they were trying to call it bourbon whiskey, but I think what they were doing was, because Maysville was in Mason County, which was an old part of Bourbon County, was once part of Bourbon County, they were just letting people know that, yes, you can buy this whiskey in Maysville, but it came from Bourbon County and the current size of Bourbon County. And what furthers my evidence in this is the first mention after that I could find was in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and it was specifically talking about Bourbon County whiskey. It says, we have Bourbon County whiskey for sale. And it wasn't until the 1840s that you started seeing bourbon show up again. And again, it was always Bourbon County whiskey. It was never mentioned as Bourbon Street whiskey, and it was never mentioned as just bourbon whiskey. They would always toss in the word Bourbon County, which showed that it was a geographical indicator rather than being a style, which is what we kind of think of it when we go through the Elijah Craig concept of, oh, he decided to call it bourbon, and bourbon is a style now.
So where did it get its name then, officially?
So it just evolved. I mean, it's one of those things that, of course, we're never going to find somebody who went, you know what, we should call this bourbon. And the other thing that's tough about trying to pin an origin on the name bourbon, other than saying that it did result from the early distillers in Bourbon County sending their whiskey out, is that it just there were no rules for bourbon back then. The rules for bourbon weren't codified until 1936. So you could call anything bourbon back then. And in fact, I found a distiller named James Miller who was selling his bourbon rye whiskey in Charleston, South Carolina in the 1840s. So this pretty much shows that it's talking again about bourbon having a reputation, the county having a reputation, and ultimately it got usurped by the entire state, and that likely was because they were starting to ship through Louisville, and then anything coming out of Kentucky. Bourbon was, a name that when these rectifiers were coming out now with neutral grain spirits and flavoring them, they would have recipes. There are recipes in the 1850s for making bourbon out of neutral grain spirits. So there was a flavor profile and a reputation for bourbon by the 1850s. And so, again, as I say, it kind of evolved out of that to put an actual origin to it. The county is the best that I can say, that it just came out of the county's name.
Are there any myths that you were not able to correct?
Oh, there are surprises that pop up that are kind of, you look at them and say, is that, can I definitively say that I have debunked that particular piece of lore? And I tend to put those to the side and wait. And, they'll show up in later books if I can actually find a particular answer to them. But this was an interesting way that I did this book. Is I started out by coming up with 101 pieces of lore. And the first thing I did was I went into AI and I asked AI for what the answers would be, because it was my belief that AI is just it is basically technology that has gone out like a great search engine and found all of these different articles and then condensed the information down into simple answers. And so it's a good way to kind of take the pulse of what we believe is true and what isn't true. And there are certain cases where I was surprised that AI would come back and they would say, oh, America's native spirit is one of those that I asked AI, and it said that was false, that bourbon was not called America's native spirit. Of course, as I go through and I do the research, come to find out it wasn't in 1964 when it was called America's native spirit, but it was actually Senator Jim Bunning in 2007 that put it into the record and said that it's America's native spirit. And so it made sense that AI would get that wrong, because that's a particular piece of information that isn't as prevalent on websites. If you go to anybody who talks about the America's native spirit slogan, they're going to point to that 1964 instance. And that was just a misunderstanding that Bunning had when he used the words America's native spirit. And in a strange twist, it turns out that by saying it in the resolution, he actually declared it by doing that. So, yeah, it's fascinating. It was the reason I did the search on AI and was prompted to do that was because I was talking to a friend of mine who's worked in the marketing industry for years. And he said that he was starting to do articles using AI. He would feed in what he wanted the article written about, and then he would just produce the article and then post it on a website. And I said, you do understand that AI is not necessarily trustworthy, that AI is going to give you what common concepts are. And it could be that a story developed out of one newspaper and it was incorrect, and other newspapers picked it up, and sure, it's coming from multiple sources, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's true or that the journalist did their due diligence in the original article. So,
one of the great myths of all time is the fact that during Prohibition, there were only 6 licensed distilleries.
yes.
And that's not true, is it?
This is what's really interesting about that. I wanted to see if I could prove that it was true. And sometimes that's the best way to try to dig into lore, is to take your assumption and go, okay, I have a listing here of 6 distilleries, so it must be true because they've actually named the 6 distilleries. Let me see where these all started from. And there's as I'm digging in and I'm doing it, it is so much more complicated. We try so hard to make history into sound bites. And the real story behind those distilleries is much more complex, in that what I found was the original plan was that it wasn't supposed to be 6 Kentucky distilleries, which is what you hear and what the list you see is, that is passed around in terms of what distilleries were offered the opportunity to be the first to distill as medicinal stocks were getting low. It was supposed to be split between Pennsylvania and Kentucky, and there was supposed to be less rye whiskey made, but there was supposed to be rye whiskey made. But what happened was there was a company called American Medicinal Spirits, which had a lot of concentration warehouses with all the old medicinal whiskey in it. And all of a sudden, their name was popping up as multiple distilleries on this distilling list. And so there was kickback, or there was arguments in Congress about this. And what are we doing? We're creating a monopoly here in medicinal spirits. And so what the commissioner decided to do was, well, we won't really announce who these distilleries are, and then we will give the licenses out one at a time. And so it's interesting that actually 5 Kentucky distillery names were amongst the first 5 to be released, but 2 of them, James E. Pepper and Frankfurt, were not. They didn't have distilleries set up at that point. They didn't have the equipment to be able to run. So they utilized the other distilleries to work in. So do you count those distilleries or do you not count those distilleries, because they're not actually distilling their own stuff? And meanwhile, the distilleries in Pennsylvania were slower to get ramped up. And so it's really interesting, because the other story I bumped into here, which was really added to another piece of lore, was that I found that George T. Stagg was going to be the 4th Kentucky distillery that was supposed to actually get up and running, but they had a fire, and that fire shut their operations down, which, of course, if we know Buffalo Trace's story, they suggest that they are the oldest continuously running distillery. However, if you count that they had a fire and they couldn't run during that time when they had had their equipment shut down, then that kind of debunks that as well, although there was no distilling going on between 1921 and 1929. So,
and 1929 is when the first medicinal licenses were issued.
That was basically, it went through a big fight and ended up that, yes, that is when they started issuing them slowly out. So Bernheim was actually the first distillery to start distilling, and they were distilling Old McBrayer was the first whiskey to come off the line, and that was in December of 1929.
How much fun are you having doing this?
It's great. I mean, I think when you read the book, because I inject regular history into it as well. So when I started trying to figure out who the original master distiller was, where did that title come from? I had to understand what mastery was all about. What is this concept of mastery? And so I wanted to go back and dig into history and see, first of all, how did that concept come about before I started diving into this idea of who's the first person to get the name master distiller? How did that evolve over time? And so I'm a curious person, and I want to understand and also relate whiskey history to other histories as well, to show that it's a endeavor that requires a serious nature to it. It's been full of lore for a long time, and we've accepted that. But my push is to get people to look at whiskey history as part of overall human history, because it has tied in so much into our lives. So finding those little discoveries and tying regular history in with whiskey history, and then learning things that I've been saying wrong for the longest time and being able to correct those, and then see the surprises on people's faces when you reveal to them that what we think we've known all along isn't really true. There's a lot of satisfaction in that. And I know that there are people that are going to come along after me, and they're probably going to debunk some of the things that I've come up with, because sometimes you'll speculate as a historian, and when you do that, you're always opening yourself up for an ability for somebody to find, oh, wait, that's not true because I found this fact over here. But I love that. I love the fact that at some point, hopefully, people will be challenging my work as well to further our knowledge of history.
What can we expect from Volume 2?
Oh man, well, that 1866 date for Jack Daniels is going to get a challenge. That's one of those that I have talked about a little bit in the Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey. I want to pull that story together, and I've got like I say, I've got so many others to kind of run through. I want to talk about Prohibition and really get into this concept that people say, oh, Prohibition started on January 17th, 1920. But there were already 30 plus states that were in Prohibition before that. And I want to really dig into that and find out, when did these states go in? Why did they go in? That sort of thing. And then also dig into limestone filtered water, because we hear that limestone filtered water is what makes Kentucky bourbon so wonderful. Yet when I go to Ireland, I hear that they have limestone. I go to Tennessee, they got limestone. I go to Illinois, they got limestone. So what is it that makes Kentucky different in terms of its limestone filtered water, or does anything? Is there any difference between?
Or is it just a Kentucky claim?
Yeah. And I have done some initial research into it, and I will tell you there is a difference. But I'm just going to leave it at a teaser with that.
Drew Hannush's latest book is Whiskey Lore Volume 1, and it's available through Amazon right now. We've posted a link in the show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. And thanks to Drew for joining us on this week's WhiskyCast In-Depth. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with the new Woodford Reserve Double Oaked Bourbon. It's bottled at 45.2% ABV, and the nose has touches of caramel, molasses, tobacco, and charred oak. The taste has notes of cherry cola, black pepper, caramel, tobacco leaf, and honey. The finish is long and oaky with a touch of spice. It's a bit too oaky for my taste. I'm scoring the Woodford Reserve Double Oaked Bourbon an 89. Next up, the latest batch of Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. Batch A125 is bottled at 59.1% ABV and is 10 years and 7 months old. The nose is full of caramel, vanilla, honey, and dark chocolate with a touch of oak. The taste is peppery with cinnamon, black pepper, and clove notes balanced by caramel, red apples, and honey in the background. The finish, long and spicy with a nice underlying sweetness. I'm scoring the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof Batch A125 a 93. Angel's Envy sells a non-port finished bottled in bond bourbon, but you have to go to the distillery in Louisville to get your hands on it. Of course, it's bottled at 50% ABV, and the nose has touches of caramel, red grapes, red apples, honey, and vanilla. The taste is spicy, fruity, and bold with notes of apple cobbler, cinnamon, nutmeg, caramel, honey, and vanilla, while the finish is long with lingering spice. I'm scoring the Angel's Envy Bottled in Bond Bourbon a 93. And finally, my Burns Night Dram was an 8-year-old Kalila single cask from Cask Share's Collective series. It was distilled in 2016 and bottled at 60.8% ABV. The nose has the usual Kalila peat smoke and creosote, along with touches of lemon pepper, heather, and honey. The taste is thick and oily, with lemon pepper spice and peat smoke, complemented by iodine for a slightly medicinal character. The finish, long, tart, and smoky. I'm scoring the Kalila 8-year-old single cask from Cask Share's Collective series a 91. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of more than 3,800 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at WhiskyCast.com. Now let's open up the WhiskyCast community app and see what people are talking about this week in our community segment. There was an interesting poll published this week by YouGov showing that 1 in 3 Americans plans to drink less this year, whether for health reasons or for cost. After I posted a link to the poll results in the app, we got a bunch of responses. Tom the Tracer Bullet posted this: I'm drinking a lot less, but it's dry January, so that's probably going to change next month. From Scott Rogers in Wisconsin, makes sense to me for a number of reasons, chiefly that Americans significantly increased drinking in the wake of spring 2020. So a reversion to the mean seems to be expected, and alcohol consumption had generally been declining prior to 2020. Christopher Glenn added this: I have made an effort to drink less so far in 2025. Alan Chanel is also drinking less. He posted this comment: interesting, for me, 1, I've opted for dry January. 2, I've opted for no buy January, as December whiskey spending was high. 3, in 2024, I spent more money on whiskey than in past years, yet bought fewer bottles, less try-and-see purchases, and greater focus on better-tasting purchases, even though the bottle costs more. And 4, having visited Scotland for the first time in April 2024, my second half of 2024 purchases included more Scotch and less American whiskey. Finally, Memphis Trumpet added this comment: those who are doing dry January this year sure picked the wrong January for it. What's your take? Are you drinking less this year? Download the free WhiskyCast community app and join the conversation. You'll find it in your app store, and you can find us on social media too. Look for WhiskyCast on Blue Sky, X, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. I'm often asked about the best way to store one's whiskeys. There are a lot of people out there who store them like wine on their sides with the idea that that will keep the cork wet. It does, but in this case you're actually doing more damage than good. That's because the high alcohol content of whiskeys can actually cause the cork to deteriorate over time. Wines are typically no more than 14 to 15% alcohol, compared to whiskeys at 40% or higher, which is why it pays to keep wine on its side. However, other rules for storing whiskey parallel those of wine. Keep them in a relatively dark room out of direct sunlight, and while they don't need to be refrigerated, a cool room is best. For instance, my whiskey room is in the basement where the temperature is consistent all year round. Finally, one tip for avoiding the dreaded broken cork when you're opening a bottle of whiskey that's been stored for a while: turn it upside down and give it a good shake before pulling the cork. That'll lubricate the cork just enough to keep it from breaking off inside the bottle. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just get in touch with us. That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on X, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. Or you can use the WhiskyCast community app. Download it today from your app store. Our email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
Dewar's Double Double 38-year-old blended malt has arrived, and it's a true gem for collectors. Secure a bottle and you'll be adding a rare piece of history to your collection.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2025, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.